Please join me in prayer. Open our eyes, Spirit of God, so we can see what you're up to in our world. Amen. Today is Pentecost, one of those Christian holy days with deep roots in Judaism. Pentecost is a Jewish festival associated with the wheat harvest that celebrates Moses receiving the Ten Commandments from God atop Mount Sinai 7 weeks, according to tradition, after the Exodus. Pentecost for us occurs 7 weeks or 50 days after Easter. Some call it the church's birthday, when God's Spirit transformed the first followers of Jesus from being an anxious group huddled together in a Jerusalem home into a pioneering church that carried God's Spirit, God's breath, God's wind, God's fire to each of the world's people groups. The symbol of this transnational spirit in today's reading from the book of Acts is the ability of these first church members to speak and understand the languages of the nations. I came across a funny story a few weeks back that sounded to me like a good Pentecost story about languages. The story was told by Ira Glass of This American Life. Glass was in Paris, visiting the writer David Sedaris. The two of them had set out to walk through the city on a 3-day tour when suddenly Sedaris stopped on the sidewalk. "This is my worst nightmare right here," he said. "We've barely gone 3 blocks, said Glass. Sedaris continued, "Okay, my lighter has run out of fluid, which would mean that I would have to ask somebody for a match in order to smoke, and so I would say, 'Hello, do you have some fire?' I will not spend the afternoon asking people if they have fire," Glass explains. I was curious about David's thoughts about Paris. He didn't move here with his head full of Ernest Hemingway and Gertrude Stein and Sartre and Proust. He was a blank slate. And so for several hours every day I was in Paris, David would walk me to the places he finds most interesting. And the first thing I learned was this: it's so traumatic to learn a new language that a lot of David's experience of the city, a lot of his personal geography of Paris, has to do simply with returning to those places where he didn't feel embarrassed about not speaking the language well. Glass asked Sedaris, "Is your experience here more of a feeling of adventure or more of a feeling of humiliation?" "It's more a feeling of humiliation," replied Sedaris. "It would be a feeling of adventure if I were a different type of person, if I were a more adventurous person. But for me to get on a train and go to, say, Switzerland, I don't think, 'Oh, good, I get to have an adventure.' I think, 'Oh, great, I get to make a fool out of myself in 2 different languages.' And that's what I wind up doing. In Germany, they always include breakfast with your hotel. I'm not a breakfast eater, but I do drink coffee. I stayed at a hotel in Germany the first time I was there, and so I go downstairs to have my breakfast, and there are 6 people seated at a table. And usually they've got lots of tables, but here there's only 1. And I'm thinking, well, I don't really want to sit with 6 people, but if I turn around and leave, they'll think I'm being rude. So I've gotten this far, so I have to sit down at the table with these 6 people. So I pull out a chair, and the man says something to me in German. And I say, 'Oh no, just coffee for me, I'm fine with that.' And what he was trying to tell me was that I was in his kitchen. This was the kitchen of the owner, and this was the owner of the hotel and his family sitting down to breakfast. I just saw this door, and I opened it and walked through. I was in their personal quarters. And then he had to go and wake up his 9-year-old, so his 9-year-old could come and explain to me in English that, in fact, the dining room was downstairs." Sedaris went on to say that he doesn't just feel humiliated in these moments, he also feels more alive. "It makes me notice everything around me," he said. "When I become complacent like I was in the U.S., you just get used to things and you don't really think about them. You think, I'll just get a cab, or I'll go to the airport, I'll have a patty melt. You don't think about it. Whereas now, with me, anxiety starts early on. And I'm always afraid that somebody's going to throw me a curveball and ask me a question like, 'What sign are you?' Just ask me a question like that out of nowhere and I'll appear foolish. So it keeps me on edge. But really, the edginess has always made me feel alive. Someday," he concludes, "I'll be more comfortable in France. My accent will improve and the daily anxiety will be removed from my life. And when it's removed from me, then I'll probably not be interested in living here anymore. I'll probably leave because it'll be just like living at home. One reason that Sidera's story reminded me of Pentecost is, of course, because it talks about language. And one of the highlights of that first Pentecost, according to today's reading from Acts, is how God's Spirit created a polyglot church, a multilingual church. But the Sidera's story also connects language and place. French, the language spoken in Paris, the place. And on that first Pentecost, a diverse group of people from various nations, various places, had gathered in the same place, in Jerusalem, expecting, no doubt, to speak Greek to each other, the language of commerce in the first century, much like English is today. The language of Roman government was Latin. The language of native Judeans was Aramaic, but the common tongue throughout the Roman world was Greek. And so the shock of Pentecost, when God's Spirit blew in like a storm, what Barbara Brown Taylor in her sermon on this text calls a holy hurricane. The shock of Pentecost was that this holy gale enabled the followers of Jesus to speak not just multiple languages, but specific dialects with all the little nuances and distinctions and inflections and accents that separate people groups by region and by place. How is it, said the crowd at Pentecost, that we hear each of us in our own native language? The Greek word for language here is where we get our word dialect from. A different translation of the crowd's question could be, how is it that we hear our own dialects into which we have been born? The followers of Jesus were speaking as if they were native speakers, born to speak in a particular way. Not just English, for example, but North American English. And not just North American English, but Northeast U.S. English. And not just Northeast U.S. English, but New England English from Cape Ann, Massachusetts, and even more specifically from Gloucester and from East Gloucester, right on the coast, the dialect of the fishermen. In the film My Fair Lady, Professor Higgins boasted that he could place a person within 2 streets of his home in London just based on accent. The miracle of Pentecost was that God's Spirit blew in like a North Atlantic gale and transformed the followers of Jesus into a church that, as we say in the UCC, is for all the people, regardless of their place or native dialect. But there's more to Pentecost than just languages and places and dialects. Pentecost is a tale about a great reversal. That first Pentecost didn't just traverse differences of place and speech, it reversed them, at least theologically. In today's reading from Genesis, the so-called Tower of Babel story, we heard the tale of the origins of divisions in humanity. As the writer of Genesis tells it, the world's people had once been completely unified, speaking in the same tongue, able to devise a plan to construct a grand tower that could reach to the heavens. Like other great tales in Genesis, the creation story or the fall story or the story of Noah's flood, the tale of the Tower of Babel is trying to make a moral point. The tower attracts God's attention, who worries that if the humans succeed, they will become too prideful and begin to think they are gods. So according to the tale, God confounds them by breaking up their single language into various tongues and dialects. Pentecost is, in a way, Babel in reverse. Not the recreation of a single tongue, but the creation of a single church comprised of many tongues and many dialects. But there's still more. Pentecost is about reversing Babel, and it is about the birth of the church that announces God's love in the nuanced dialects of all the people in all their various places. But there's still more. Pentecost is also about breath, about breathing God. God's Spirit blew in at Pentecost, according to today's reading from the Psalms, in a spirit that is a wind, the same breath even that moves and blows and fills the lungs and sustains the lives of every creature. The psalmist speaks of God's Spirit with a Hebrew word that can mean spirit or wind or gust or breeze or breath. God's wind, God's breeze moved over the waters at creation like a muse inspiring an artist. A blast of wind from God drew back the waters at the Exodus so the people of Israel could march to freedom. God's Spirit inspired Israel's artisans to build the first tabernacle. Jesus exhaled God's Spirit into his followers in today's reading from the Gospel of John. And God's breath blows life into all creation, according to the psalmist. I love how the Celtic Christians put it when they say that God is above and under, before and behind us, on our left and right, and in our very breath. In our breath. Pentecost is about remembering to breathe, remembering that God is in every breath, in the breath of every creature, connecting us and moving through us, flowing through all creation, as the psalmist says. The same Spirit, the same breath moves through each person, regardless of the place they call home, regardless of the distinct dialect they speak. The same breath, the breath of God, flows through terrorist and victim. It flows through Muslim and Jew. It flows through Republican and Democrat, Israeli and Palestinian, police officer and an African-American male who says while being choked, "I can't breathe." The same Spirit is in a baby's first cry and an elderly man's last whisper before passing into the presence of God. This breath is in our prayers and our songs, our chants, our protesting voices. It moves through the words we speak to our partner when we say, "I love you." This Spirit can be a peaceful dove or a gale force wind, or as the Celtic Christians say, it can be unpredictable and uncontrollable, like a wild goose. This wild goose-like, dove-like Spirit, God's Spirit, drives us in the church to, as the UCC slogan puts it, protect the environment and care for the poor and forgive often and reject racism and fight for the powerless and share earthly and spiritual resources and embrace diversity and love God and enjoy this life. We inhale God's presence. It fills us and binds us to each other and binds us to the world's others and to the natural world. And it inspires us to set to work, reversing the world's babbles. Let me close with a story about the science of how we're all connected. It's told by journalist A.J. Jacobs. I got an email, says Jacobs, from a man in Israel who had read one of my books. And the email said, "You don't know me, but I'm your 12th cousin." And it said, "I have a family tree with 80,000 people on it, including you, Karl Marx, and several European aristocrats." Now, continues Jacobs, I didn't know what to make of this. Part of me was like, okay, when's he going to ask me to wire $10,000 to his Nigerian bank? I also thought, 80,000 relatives, do I want that? I have enough trouble with the ones I already have. But another part of me said, this is remarkable. I'm connected to 80,000 people around the world, and that's 4 Madison Square Gardens full of cousins. There are sites online that crowdsource family trees, he says. You load your family tree, and then these sites search to see if the A.J. Jacobs in your tree is the same as the A.J. Jacobs in another tree. And if it is, then you combine, and then you combine, and combine, and combine, until you get these massive mega family trees with thousands of people on them, or even millions. My world family tree, says Jacobs, has no less than a jaw-dropping 75 million people connected by blood or marriage, sometimes both, on all 7 continents. My cousin is Gwyneth Paltrow. She has no idea I exist, but we're officially cousins. We have just 17 links between us. And there's also my cousin Barack Obama. He's my aunt's 5th great-aunt's husband's father's wife's 7th great-nephew. So he's practically my older brother. The actor Kevin Bacon is my first cousin's twice removed's wife's niece's husband's first cousin once removed's niece's husband. We're all connected, continues Jacobs. And 75 million may seem like a lot, but in a few years it's quite likely we will have a family tree with all or almost all 7 billion people on Earth. We all come from the same ancestor, he says. And you don't have to believe the literal Bible version, but scientists talk about Y-chromosomal Adam and mitochondrial Eve from about 100,000 to 300,000 years ago. We all have a bit of their DNA in us. They are our great-great-great-great-great-great, continue that for about 7,000 times, grandparents. And so that means we literally are all biological cousins. Estimates vary, but probably the furthest cousin you have on Earth is about a 50th cousin. Jacobs concludes, I think that there's a human bias to treat your family a little better than strangers. I think this tree is going to be bad news for bigots, because they're going to have to realize that they are cousins with thousands of people in whatever ethnic group they happen to have issues with. We're not just part of the same species, we're part of the same family. We share 99.9% of our DNA. I think the more inclusive the idea of family is, the better, because then you have more potential caretakers. And as my aunt's 8th cousin, twice removed, Hillary Clinton says, it takes a village. Pentecost and the science of DNA seem to me to be saying the same thing, that we're more alike than we are different, regardless of place and race and dialect, that we breathe the same air, partake of the same spirit, feel the same breeze. It flows through us, through our natural world, binding us together in a kind of spiritual ecosystem. So maybe the lesson of Pentecost for us today is to just breathe. Amen.